Today I'm going to show you a really unique endgame position that I reached in one of my online chess games on chessworld.net. I'm going to show you a way to win an endgame with pawns on both sides of the board with a knight versus a bishop while also being down by a pawn. This is really unique because most of the time a bishop crushes a knight in the endgame with pawns on both sides of the board. At the very least, the side with the bishop is much better. Furthermore, if you are down by a pawn in the endgame, it is very hard to even draw, much less win. I'm going to show you an example where a knight can crush a bishop in the endgame with pawns on both sides of the board, while also being down by a pawn. This way, if you ever get into an endgame with a knight versus a bishop, with pawns on both sides of the board, or on one side of the board, either way, you know a strategy that you can use to improve your position and have good chances. Knight versus bishop is a very common endgame battle that takes place, so it is very important to know it really well. Alright, let's talk about some of the imbalances to think about why a bishop normally crushes a knight in the endgame, and how a knight could crush a bishop. In the endgame, the bishop is often much better than the knight because it can move quickly from one side of the board to the other. The knight is much slower and thus cannot get there in time to stop the bishop. Now, if each player had only 3 pawns apiece and all the pawns were on the same side of the board, then the knight would probably be able to hold against the bishop, depending on the specific situation. It is when pawns are on both sides of the board that the side with the knight will most likely lose. Now let's talk about an exception to the rule. If there are pawns on both sides of the board, but the bishop is unable to attack them, then the knight could very well be the better piece. The knight, unlike the bishop, can attack on both the dark and the white colored squares. As we can see here in this position, his bishop can only attack my f3 pawn. It cannot attack any of the other pawns. It cannot attack any of the other pawns, and there is not a way to force my pawns onto the light colored squares where it could potentially attack it. If he could attack my pawns with his king, then he might be able to force them to run up the board to the squares that the bishop could attack. But because of the close nature of the position, the pawns are pretty much set in place. I realized that his knight on b5 is actually much better than his bishop. If I could trade my bishop for his knight, then I would have a really good endgame and could even be winning. With my knight, I can defend my pawns and attack his pawns. His bishop can only defend his pawns and cannot attack mine with the exception of the f3 pawn. Therefore, really only I can attack, and this way a knight can crush a bishop in the endgame with pawns on both sides of the board, even when you are down by a pawn. And he starts with bishop out to e4 looking to win a pawn. King to e5. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at this for a second. If I were to play bishop takes on b5 right away, then this is not very good because my knight is not able to defend against his passed pawn from a good position. My knight would be very passive on b8 and would not be able to attack anything. I want my knight to really be on b6, so that way it can blockade the b5 pawn and also be able to attack the c4 pawn. So that is very good. Therefore, I am patient and I play king out to e5 first. And my king is well placed, and if either his bishop or his knight moves, then my king could quickly enter the position and start attacking his pawns. So therefore he starts to move his king. And he probably should have maybe moved his knight, probably a bit sooner than this. Now after knight f6 he plays king to f1. And I am now ready to take on b5, since my knight can now move to d7 and then to b6 and blockade his passed pawn. So that I will be able to get the position that I really want. My knight will stop his passed pawn and will also put some pressure on his c4 pawn, so that way I could have ideas maybe of a5 to a4. And here I start with king out to d4 first, in order to get the best position for my king. and prevent him from having any counterplay. Now if he were to play b6 right away, then simply knight to d7 attacks the pawn, so b7 and then king out to c3. And he cannot defend the pawn on b3. If bishop d1, simply king d2, he can't defend the bishop. The bishop has to move and then simply king out to c2. And I win this pawn, create this passed pawn, and could also win the c4 pawn as well as the d5 pawn. I then come back over here and win this pawn. So basically all of his pawns could fall here. Therefore he decides to play the really good move, king out to e1. This way he can play bishop out to d1 and protect it with the king, so that I cannot chase the bishop away, so that I won't be able to win the b3 pawn as easily. And now that my king has been placed on the best possible square, I am going to look to improve my knight. Knight b6, really good square. King out to e2, and it is very difficult for him to find good moves. He cannot attack any of my pawns, and he just has to wait and defend and see if he can hold the game. I mean, he is up by one pawn. He has a bishop versus a knight with pawns on both sides of the board, and yet he has no counterplay. He has no way to win the game, and he can't attack anything. That's pretty amazing. There are many themes that run throughout this game. The position of the king, for one, the squares that the pawns sit on, and the knight versus bishop battle. It's very dynamic and it's very good to look at this and see those ideas. And here's another chess concept. It's a breakthrough concept, and I'm also undermining the c4 pawn. So that's very important. And the knight stops both of the pawns from moving. You can't move these pawns down the board without them being captured. So he just plays king out to e1, then king to b4, and now I am prepared to play knight back to b6 and either win the a pawn or win the d pawn, and you cannot defend both of them. So knight takes d5. And now I simply play c4, and notice that his king has nowhere to go. If he could, he might play king out to d3 and try to get his king over here to have some counterplay, but because of the pawn on c4 and because of my knight, he can't do anything. So he just starts moving back and forth. And white cannot make any progress. His king cannot move up the board, and he doesn't have any counterplay with passed pawns. His bishop cannot attack anything. Yeah, the bishop could run way over here, but I mean, it really can't attack anything. It could potentially attack the c4 pawn, but that's so well defended. So yeah, and then he went ahead and resigned here. The game could have continued with bishop out to d1, and then d3, and then his bishop could not move. The king would have to move back, and then c3, and I would simply be able to win his bishop, and thus also be able to win these passed pawns and the endgame. So thank you for watching, and hope that you learned a lot of